All right, so now that we've sort of gotten that first sphere out of the way, let's take a look more at how to actually get around in this interface. I know that that was sort of a quick overview, and now it's time to kind of really get comfortable with how to actually get around our scenes. So building off of the example that we just did, I've got our sphere scene here, and let's just talk about how to navigate around the viewport. So in cinema, what a lot of people use the 1, 2, and the 3 keys to, um, you know, um, tumble, pan, and zoom in and out of their scene. Those keys are bound differently in Houdini. So typically, what I do when I'm navigating is I'll use the Alt key as my sort of key that engages my camera, and then the left, middle, and right mouse button to do those respective tasks, such as tumbling, panning, and zooming. This is sort of if you had a Maya background, that's similar to how navigation occurs in Maya and in other DCCs, and it's really easy to get used to. So, just to demonstrate, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and you can see my little hand shows up here. I'm going to left click and drag, and I am tumbling around my object. Similarly, with the middle mouse button pressed, I can pan, and then with the right mouse button pressed, when I drag, it goes in and out. In addition to using the right mouse button and dragging your mouse to go in and out, you can also, while holding down Alt, zoom in and out by using your scroll wheel on the middle mouse. So yeah, when I hold down the Alt key, you can also see that it's switching between my selection icon up here and the camera down here. So I'm holding Alt now, and the camera is selected, and I'm able to move. So that's just a little thing to note. We'll get into more of these toolbars on the left-hand side, but for right now, let's just talk really quickly about how to select objects. So I've got this selection tool is automatically set. If I select the sphere shows up. You can see it being selected over here with this little yellow outline in the network editor. Likewise, if I select the grid, you can see it switches to the grid object over here. The only other thing that's kind of worth noting at this point of the tools on the left-hand side is the manipulator icon. The manipulator icon will give me handles so that I can do things like move my grid around. You can see it adjusting the transform up here in the parameters view. Now, if I try to go select my sphere, though, you'll see that I can't. The manipulator is sort of tied to the grid at this point. And that is because this little icon, which indicates secure selection, is turned on. If I turn that off, while having the manipulator selected, I can change the object that I'm selecting, like so. We're just going to turn secure selection back on, and just note that if you're ever kind of having a hard time selecting your objects, that might be why. A quick shortcut is hitting the S key, and it brings you back into selection mode, and then you get these nice pre-selection highlights. One other thing worthwhile to note at this point right here is the framing shortcuts, which is similar to what you would use the O key. I believe it's the O key in Cinema 4D. Helps you frame your selections. For example, if I've got my light selected and I want to be staring directly at my light, a shortcut I can hit is spacebar F, and that kind of snaps my view to frame the light that I have selected. If I go over here to my network view and select the sphere object and hit spacebar F, I'm now framed on the sphere object. The only other one that I use really frequently is also spacebar H, which is sort of, I consider, the home selection, and that just basically frames everything that's visible in your scene. So I'm just going to hit spacebar F to get back to sort of a normal view here, and pan around until I'm sort of back to where I was when we started. Also going to hop over here, select our grid object, and I'm going to just zero out the translate, so that's back to normal. Yeah, let's drop it down a little bit to negative 0.1 probably. Yeah, negative 0.2. There we go. All right, so at this point you might be asking yourself, where is the object manager? You know, we've got our objects over here, which is not really laid out in this typical hierarchy that we're used to. Where's the sort of, you know, hierarchical list of things? And one of the places where those are located is in the tree view. And in this view, again, I'm using the build layout. In the build layout, they actually have a pane that is hiding behind these tools over on the left that actually is the tree view. And if I scroll down to these little icons in the middle, you can see that this little arrow pops out to indicate that I can restore the minimized pane. So I'm going to click that, and you can see over here, I have what looks like a hierarchy of objects. But what are these other objects? Now, briefly, Houdini has different contexts in which it operates. Different contexts for accomplishing different types of tasks. This first one, if I click on it, you can see our network changes over here. That's because it's brought us into where we would have a collection of motion effects networks where we can lay down things such as chops or channel operators to do anything from creating your own jiggle deformer, which we'll do in a later lesson, or you could use audio to drive procedural animation. It's a very fun context to play around in for sure. Next up, we've got the image context, and in here you can see we've got a comp network. Now, inside of these compositing networks, you can use things called cops, which are compositing operators. Basically, you can do anything from building shaders like you would in Substance Designer to actually compositing your final passes of your renders. In a node-like workflow that's similar to Nuke or something like Fusion. Now, the next one up is the matte context. This is sort of like your shader graph. If you're using Espresso in Cinema 4D or Redshift, this is sort of where you tie in all those little elements of your shaders. You can see those shaders that we created in the previous lesson are just sort of sitting here in sort of, a different type of a context than the material palette that we had before. This material palette is sort of an overview, whereas this matte context is a much more deeper level of control over your shader. And then coming up after that is the object context. I'm just going to skip over that briefly. This is the context which we're in right now, that we've been doing most of our work. But the other two contexts we have here is the output context. You can see the output is where we create our render nodes. Everything is a node. So when we're going to render something, we're going to create a render node, and here it is. This is our mantra IPR node, and we've got all of our render settings in this parameter view up here. If you're using other render engines, you'll throw down other render engine nodes in this section. And then lastly, we've got this shop context, and this was shader operations. This is actually a depreciated version of the matte context, is the way I like to think of it. It's here, I think, mostly to support older projects, but we won't be doing anything in shops. We're just going to be doing everything in our matte context up here that has to do with creating shaders. So all of those are sort of laid out in our global scene here. You can see you've got all of these little contexts. And for our purposes, just getting started, we're mostly focused with this object context. You can see up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is our objects context. And inside of here, we have our objects. And then inside of our objects, we actually have our parametric geometry that creates our actual geometry. You can see here, if I switch this over to sort of a more generic view, and then maybe I'll switch to a wireframe. Here you can see I can change like how much resolution is on my sphere, the radius of my sphere, etc. So over here, we have the object context, which has our sphere object, which is more like a container. And inside the container is the sphere geometry that we've actually created and are representing it back up at the object level by viewing whichever flag is displayed inside of our SOPs network. So when you hear people refer to SOPs, they're actually referring to what goes on inside of these objects. So if I jump down in here, you can see it says the geometry context here, and this is a SOP. It's a surface operator, generally designed to, or generally, used to describe things that you are doing to manipulate geometry that isn't dynamics. The other context that is available that we haven't really gotten into is the dynamics context. We'll be dealing with a ton later on, but that is what you would hear people refer to as DOPs, or dynamics operators. Those are the things that you would throw around when you're doing a simulation. So that's just, in a nutshell, what the different contexts of Houdini do and or are for. But for right now, let's just focus on the object and SOPs context that we have going on over here right now. So again, you can see underneath each one of these, I kind of think of them as like folders. Like over here, these kind of appear like folders. You've got your grid object and you've got things inside of it. I can dive inside here. I can set like the size of my grid in different dimensions. If I zoom back out, I'm going to take this out of wireframe back to smooth shaded mode. I'm going to change my lighting to be a little bit better. And yeah, so you can see we're in our grid here. So got our grid inside of our grid object. What if I wanted to actually have this grid be a child of the sphere object? Well, I can't just simply in this object manager like thing, I can't drag the grid to be inside of the sphere object. It just doesn't work that way. Likewise, I can't take the sphere object and make it like a child of this environment light, or make the environment light a child of the grid object. It's just not set up that way. And we'll get more into how to parent and unparent objects later on when we get into geometry manipulation. But just know that it's really not where you organize your scene in general. This helps navigate, but I rarely use it. Most of what I'm doing is over here in the network view. So let's explore this network view for now. I look in here, you can use your tab key to create things. So for example, I'm going to create a node in a different way than we did before. So previously, if I wanted to create a torus based off the previous example, I could go up here and click torus, and that would create a torus in my network for me. Or I could go down here and hit the tab key and then start typing. This brings you up a list of all the operators that are available to you in this current context. I could start typing something like torus. And you can see that it starts filtering my results out to get the torus. So once I've typed a few letters and I've gotten close to, it started to filter down to what I want. I just hit the enter key, and then you can see that my mouse has this icon kind of following it around until I click my left mouse button, and it has dropped a torus into our scene. So that's cool. And we dive inside and you can see it's created our parametric torus geometry creation. So other things about getting around this network view before we get too far is similar controls. If I hold down the middle mouse drag, I can pan. Likewise, I can middle mouse scroll. I can use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. I can also use the hold down Alt and right click to zoom in and out. And sometimes your networks will get really big, and if you are sort of lost and you don't know where your network is, it's off screen or something like that, you can do also spacebar H, and that will frame everything up. And spacebar F similarly will frame the selected node, like so. So that's just a quick thing to know about how to navigate around in this area, and let's do some other stuff. Quick keyboard shortcut for how to get in and out of a node. I mean, you can obviously do the double click. And then once you're in here, you can see the path is actually laid out up here on top. We've got our object, sphere object, and then our sphere down here. Similar to up here in our manager or our tree view, we've got our object, and then our sphere inside. We can actually navigate backwards like you would in like a file explorer application like Windows Explorer or Finder by, I think Windows Explorer lets you do this. You can kind of navigate back to a certain point in your browser, so or in the hierarchy of your scene. So if I go and click on this object, I'm back outside. Other keys, I can hit I for inside or dive inside. So if I select my sphere object and hit I, I'm inside. And then if I select, I don't really have to have anything selected, but if I hit U, that takes us up. So U for up, I for inside. That gets you in and out of your nodes. All right, so back to what we were talking about with our object versus SOP level. We've got our objects out here, and if we dive inside, we can kind of view this object that we have just gotten inside of as like a container that contains another network of finer geometry manipulation. This is probably where you're going to spend most of your time creating geometry and modeling by throwing nodes down here in the SOPs context. The rest of the majority of your organization and workflow management will happen up here on the object level. So this is sort of where I kind of start organizing nodes into logical little chunks of, sections of my scene, simulations, etc. Suppose I would really wanted to focus on manipulating my torus and not be distracted by everything else in my scene. Well, if I jump inside the torus here, you can see everything else is kind of ghosted out. I've got my torus here. I can select faces if I wanted or whatever, but I can still see everything else in my scene. This little icon up here that looks like like a few shapes. It shows it shows like a filled in shape here and then two other ghosted shapes. We're in ghosted mode. So it says ghost other objects. That sort of just provides an x-ray of everything else in your scene that isn't the node that you're currently inside. If I say hide other objects, now we're just focused on the torus itself. If I go up here and I select show all objects, then you can see everything in your scene the way you would if you were back up on this level. So out in the object context, let's talk about our display flags. Display flags are these colored regions on the outsides of these nodes. And when you hover over your nodes, you actually get a little pop-up window that sort of makes it easier to select these flags. These are what I kind of consider to be the equivalent of the radio buttons in cinema. They just have a little bit, there's just a few more of them. We're just going to go over them real quickly to kind of understand how we can display and hide geometry in our object network. So if you look at this display flag on the right, this blue one with the eye, this is simply just turning your object on and off. You can see it visible in the viewport and not. And then this one on the left is it selectable tag. It's if I hit it and I've got my selection tag, I no longer can select that torus. It's going to select. It looks like it's going to select through to the sphere or anything else. So this sort of locks your object from being selected. Now I've turned the flag back on. I can select it. You can multiple select. You can select a bunch of nodes by either dragging a box over them or clicking and then shift clicking to select multiple objects. And here you can also toggle those flags, like multiple flags at once by, having them both selected and clicking the display flag to turn the sphere and the torus off at the same time. That's pretty simple for out here. In this last flag over here isn't really a flag at all. It's just the info. This is a very useful section to be able to diagnose like how data is flowing throughout your scene. It's not really relevant at this point. I kind of use it more actually inside of the geometry networks, but that's just there so you know what it is. We'll revisit this shortly. Let's go inside of our torus again. And in here, I'm going to just choose to hide other objects. Additionally, in the viewport, I'm going to quickly hit the D key and then go to my my background tab up here. The D key, when hovering your mouse over the viewport, just brings up display options, and I can do something like untick this box, which is displaying environment lights as backgrounds, because I don't want to look at this image that's in the background anymore. So I'm just going to click that, and that goes away back there. So that's cool. It's going to close this. So here we are. We've got our torus, and I'm just going to throw down another piece of test geometry. We've got a bunch of different test geometry in Houdini. If I am in here and I hit the tab key, it brings up my list of operators as well. And yeah, by all means, explore these to your heart's content. We're going to be using a bunch of them later on, but and it'll be more obvious how they're used later on. But there's no way we can make a course that touches all of them. And I'm constantly finding new nodes that I didn't know exist that were awesome, and they're there to save the day, so to speak. They just kind of come out of nowhere. I'm like, why didn't I know this existed? So definitely explore these. But for now, I'm going to just throw down some test geo. So I'm going to start typing test geo, and it kind of narrows my list to a few different pieces of like a shader ball, Tommy the squab, and for our purposes, let's just use the pig head. So click that. And then I'm just going to click down here to drop that into my scene. And you can see a wireframe of this pig head shows up in the viewport. So this is sort of the reason why the wireframe is showing up in the viewport is because there's a selection highlight on. If you look in the network view, there's this yellow bar circling around the pig head node. That means that this is the node that we're currently working on. It will, when this node is selected and there's a yellow outline around it, it will show a wireframe of that geo in the viewport, and it will also have its parameters visible up here. So if I click away from that, you can see that I've just clicked an empty area in the network view down here. The pig head has disappeared. Now, similarly, as we have a display flag down here, we can switch our display flag to the pig head by clicking this blue eye right here. So now we're no longer viewing our torus, we're viewing our pig head. Another handy flag is this template flag. So down here, you can see it creates a, it has this template, selectable template. So if I go over here to the torus, for example, and you see I've selected the torus, the wireframe has appeared, but I click away and then the wireframe disappears. If I click it again and then select and make it a template, we get this pink circle around it, and you can see that the wireframe stays in the scene. So it's a great way to sort of reference other parts of your network if you need to see what something else is doing while you're working on your current node, or you need to display something else down the stream, but you really want to be able to reference it. It comes in handy later. So another one of these flags is the bypass flag, and in order to demonstrate that, I'm just going to throw down a mountain on our torus. So let's select our torus. I'm going to just I'm going to put the display flag on the torus so that we're just looking at that, and then I'm going to increase the number of rows and columns to something like 50 and 50, and then down here I'm going to hit tab and start typing mountain, and I'll hit enter, and here our mountain appears. I'm going to click on this little dot at the bottom of this node, which is the output for that node. So if I take this output, wire it into the top node, the input of this mountain node, and then set the display flag down here, we can see the effects that this node is now having on our stream. So we have taken our torus from being just a regular old torus. I'm just going to turn on smooth wire shaded up here. If you click this little box, it gives you different viewing options. I just like to be able to see the wireframe while I'm working. You can see that the mountain is taking these points and pushing them around so that you get this sort of noisy looking torus. Then suppose later on what we wanted to do is we wanted to rotate the torus. So I could throw down a transform and wire this in here. And then with our transform, I could say rotate it 45 degrees in the x-axis. So now our torus has been rotated. Now, so we've got these three nodes where we started with a torus, we've added noise to it, and then we've transformed it. But for whatever reason, if I'm like troubleshooting or just trying to figure out what I'm doing, this bypass flag allows me to sort of let this stream exist as it does, but don't use this node. So if I hit this, you can see that we have our torus. It's just forgetting about being mountained for right now, or gnarled up with all that noise, and then it's just being transformed. So the bypass node lets you sort of bypass the effects of that node. So if I bypass both of those, we sort of are left where we are, even though our display flag is down here. There is really no difference. Now if I unbypass those, we're back to where we were just a second ago. Other handy flags, this one down here is the freeze flag. So that basically locks your geometry. It bakes it into your scene. It will become a part, if it's very large geometry, it will significantly increase the size of your Houdini file or HIP file. So if I hit the lock, you can see that it actually is, it gets this red flag here. And then if I do something like right click on this wire here that's leading in and say disconnect, you can see that nothing is hooked up to this last node, but its display flag is on and it's showing the geometry that was flowing into it. So this has essentially been like a miniature cache, if you will, and it's kind of handy when you're wanting to transfer files between artists or send a file over the internet to somebody, but you don't want to send like some external geometry file that it's referencing. It doesn't really work with animations or anything, but if you just had some static geometry that you needed to, bake in to your scene for whatever reason, that is how you can. That is one way that you can do it. So you'll see if I click this to turn the lock off, it's going to break, and it'll give me a little warning. It says this operation will discard lock changes, and then you click OK, and then it throws a warning saying that not enough sources specified. So again, to figure out what that warning said, I just kind of, I'm hovering my mouse over the node, and you can see that this red exclamation point on the info flag has popped up. So I click that, and it brings up our info window, and then it says, not enough sources specified. Again, in this window, if we wanted to, we could write a little comment here to sort of denote what we're doing here. And we're just going to say, for example, I'm rotating my object. And then when I click away, you can see that it's created a little comment icon down here. If I jump back in, I can actually click this box to show the comment in the network. You can see that it is now showing that little note that I've left next to my node in the network. That can be helpful as well if you're trying to, communicate to your future self what you were working on or something of that nature. So I'm going to wire this mountain back into the transform. You can see that everything is working again. So I've got my pig head here and I've got my torus here, and suppose I want to see both of them at the same time. Well, I'm going to throw down a let's template this transform and select our pig head. I'm going to throw down another transform, and this is going to, let's just move the pig head over a little bit. I'm going to, with this transform selected, I'm going to select the manipulator tool, which brings up these handles, and I'm just going to bring the pig head over to the right and rotate it a little bit. And you can see the wireframe is what's actually displaying, the wireframe is what I'm manipulating, but the pig head still has its display flag set. Now, if I were to click the display flag down here, that wireframe goes away and the pig head moves into its position. So now let's display both these objects at the same time. We're going to use the merge node. So I'll hit the tab key, type merge, and now we can bring our two streams together. So I'm going to click this transform. I'm going to grab the output down here and wire it into the merge. And you can see this merge's input is this very much larger looking opening here. That's to indicate that you can connect as many things to this as you want, basically. So I'll just click on, oops, I disconnected that on accident. I'm going to rewire that. I'm just going to click on the top of this merge and bring it back up there, and set the display flag to merge. And now we have both of our objects visible in our scene. One other thing that is a handy flag that isn't quite apparent at the moment is if I were to go over to my this transform right here, and if I were to control click on the display flag, you see that it comes up purple. This purple is actually indicates that this is what's going to render, even though this is what is displayed. So if I hop back out here in our, I'm just going to hide the grid object for right now, and I'll hide the sphere object. In this scene, you can see that we're out here on the object level. We can see both the torus and the pig head, but if I go to the render view tab up here and hit render, it's only going to render that pig head as we have indicated with our render flag right here. So let's just give that a second. It should start to render. You can see there's no torus visible, but the pig head is being rendered. This is really handy for if you have things like high res, low res geo, where you actually had like proxy geometry that you want to be visible in the viewport that is high performance and low poly, but you want to render something that is much more dense. Render flags can be handy for stuff like that. So I'm just going to stop the render and hop back over to the scene view. Other handy organizational features in here are things like netboxes. So these icons up here, you can do different things. You can lay down an image in your scene, create subnetworks, or add little notes. So let's just do a quick netbox. Suppose like this is a section that I wanted to I had a setup here that was, special, and I just wanted to kind of organize it into its own thing. I can just drag select both of these objects and then click this little netbox icon. So click that. You can see that it creates sort of like a little section. I can just grab this now, and it's bringing both of those nodes along with it. What I accidentally just did was I shook to release. So that is something that you can do in Houdini. It's kind of cool. I'm just going to drag this back into... I'm going to just drag this wire back into the top of the mountain and then reconnect this down here. What happened was if you grab a node, it's kind of a cool way of disconnecting. But if I were to, for example, grab this transform node and give it a shake, it is now disconnected from the network. Likewise, if I just drag it back in, typically you can see that it tries to guess what you're trying to do, and it will wire itself through that network. And now we're back. Another cool way of disconnecting wires, and I use this all the time because it's actually super handy, is if you hold down the Y key, you can drag to cut your cut wires and disconnect your network. So if I'm going to click here and connect that right here. And you can see, like, if I needed to isolate this section, I could just drag a circle around it and boom, we've disconnected this. Its center is still intact, but it is no longer connected in this stream. So I'm going to bring this netbox back. I'm going to just wire in the torus and then wire this back out to the merge. And I'm going to name this, my netbox. There's a little label up there that you can label things. Likewise, if you wanted to label one of your nodes, suppose you called this transform, you wanted to call this transform like my transform. If I type in my space transform, you can see that if I hit the space bar, it automatically is going to create an underscore there. Everything basically has underscores except for netboxes. You can see that it actually respected that I put a space there. Basically, it's going to add a underscore for you. So hit enter, and there we've renamed that object. Other handy nodes like in this nature are, actually this isn't a node at all, this is a note. If I hit this note, you can see a yellow thing pops up. It kind of has gone in the middle of the scene, but if I bring this over here off to the side, you have an option to kind of leave yourself little notes. So for example, I'll maybe bring this node over here and just write a little note about what my netbox is doing. Say this netbox is adding noise and transform and say rotating by 45 degrees along X. This is kind of redundant at this point because what we've done in this netbox is so simple that it really doesn't really require any explanation, but these notes can be super handy when you have to send a file to a freelancer or to another freelancer or to another coworker or something like that. Other organizational things, you've got colors and node shapes. If I click this color, I can set, a lot of times I like to color coordinate things. So if I'm saying something in this about my netbox, I'll grab this and select a color and then grab my netbox and select a color, and then those two are color coordinated. Other things you can do in this similar regard is if I hide this and turn on this, hit this button right here, this shows the shape palette. These are really small, but for example, you can change the shapes of your nodes. So suppose I wanted both of these to be circles for whatever reason, you can just hit this little circle button or change them to be whatever shape you want them to be. I'm just going to put them back to the default. Another handy node is if I hit the O key, that brings up sort of an overview of the network. Just kind of gives you an example of, just sort of an overview of where you are in your network. It can be helpful when your networks get really big to just kind of have like an overview in your corner. I'm just going to hit the O key here to hide that. I'm also going to go back up here and click these little icons to hide the shape palette. And one last thing, in the network section for right now, I'm going to just hit the spacebar H to frame everything that I've done so far. And then I'm going to do, I just wanted to show that I could lay out these nodes in a different way if I wanted to. So if I click this merge key, sometimes I get super hung up on the fact that these streams are crossed and I want to fix that. You can hit the Shift R key And while having this node selected, it'll actually reverse the order of the input. So again, that's Shift R, and that switches that back. So that's cool. And then let's suppose that for whatever reason, I was, jamming, throwing down a bunch of nodes, and all my stuff got all laid out, all weird. And I'm just going to kill this netbox for right now. I'm just going to click it and delete. And suppose my nodes just got all sorts of messed up. I'm also going to get rid of this note. All right. So my network is just totally jacked up right now, and I need to quickly lay things out. It doesn't always work the best, but if you hit the L key while in your network view, Houdini will do its best to sort of align all of your objects, like so. And another handy quick tip is, suppose you've got a stream of nodes here that are all, you're just kind of working along, and they're, you want to get things organized. For example, if I wanted to lay out these nodes in a straight line, I could just drag them and they do kind of snap into position. But suppose I had a bunch of nodes I wanted to lay out, I could just drag, select over them. And then if I held down the A key, you see this little icon where my mouse was is turned into sort of like a grid. And now if I click my torus and drag down while holding the A key, it aligns all of those objects vertically. Likewise, we could do it if we wanted to, suppose we wanted to align the torus and the pig head horizontally. We could select both of those, hold down A, and then click on the torus and drag right, and it starts to align things horizontally. So again, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to hold down A and swipe down. That aligns those vertically. I'm going to grab these. I'm going to grab the pig head and shift select the transform and hold down A and drag down from the pig head. It aligns those vertically, and then I'm just going to eyeball this merge node in so that looks all nice and centered. Perfect. Also, if you have, for example, you're passing info around, you actually want both these pig heads to appear, or you wanted the pig head to appear in its original position like this, as well as its final position like this. You could wire also from this part of the network into the merge node. And then displaying the merge node, you can actually see you've got the torus, the original position of the pig head, and the final position of the pig head. If I just disconnect the torus stream real quick by holding down Y and dragging through to disconnect that wire, you can see we've got this, the test geometry pig head and its transform over here. But if I wanted to sort of clean up this network, one of the things you could do is if you hold down the Alt key and you click on your network or on one of the wires, that actually creates a knot, if you will, that will allow you to start, routing the traffic of your wires around one another in a way that is more like aesthetically, I guess, organized to your liking. I play around with these a lot. I find them to be super handy, and you can even split off parts of these into form other networks. For example, if I wanted to, bring this off to the side over here and then add like another mountain, if I click on this little dot that is leading out of the bottom of it, and it starts to make a connection like so, then I hit the tab key and say, let's say mountain, and then hit enter. It is now wired this off and created a separate stream with a noisy, gnarly looking pig head. So now that we've got all this kind of going on, let's just talk a little bit more about like the functions that we can do up here in the parameter view. On our mountain setting, you can see we've got like things like height, element size. We've got these sliders. We can actually change the what the frequency of our noise is. So right here it's super high frequency. Over here it's lower frequency. And I'm gonna just grab this test geometry. I'm gonna set the difficulty to easy. This is just a different level of it's sort of, there's different levels of resolution with the test geometry. And I'm just going to select easy on this one, but I'm going to subdivide it by going over here, hitting tab, typing subdiv, and I'm just going to throw this in between our two networks so we get sort of a closed geo, but much more resolution. So now that we have our mountain selected, you can kind of see it's got like a ton of amplitude. It's almost kind of folding in on itself, but I'm going to change. You can see how that noise is getting much finer detail there when we drag this about. Now, if you've got a parameter, for example, like the offset of your noise that doesn't really have a slider, you can still access slider-like functionality using the ladder. Now, I could sit here and hit 5 and it has offsetted the noise function there. Another thing I could do is I could middle mouse click on here, and you can see that this thing called the ladder appears. This actually allows you to create more or less a slider for any parameter that you're middle mouse clicking, and then you can drag in powers of 10 how much you want that parameter to be affected by your mouse. So over the offset, for example, if I middle mouse click, I can, by default, I'm hovering over tenths. So it will be modifying this value by tenths of a unit of whatever unit it is in. Now, if I go up to 1, you can see it's changing it much more rapidly, and 100 will be changing it even more rapidly. You can see now that I'm at an offset of 1,000 very quickly. Bringing that back down to close to 0. Now, if I go downwards on the ladder, you can see now I'm modifying this in by 100th of a unit and 1,000th of a unit, and even down here at a 10,000th of a unit, you can see it's barely doing anything to my geo at that level. So that's a cool thing, super handy. I use it all the time. So we've gone over basic viewport navigation. We've done some work in the network view, which is the network view and the tree view are the closest things we have to what is like an object manager in Cinema 4D. We've messed around with our parameters view, which is really like the attributes, which is really like the attribute manager in Cinema 4D. And now let's just kind of take a look at what some of these other icons and buttons around the outsides of this scene view does. So I'm going to just declutter a little bit here and go remove the tree view from the left hand side of the screen, because I don't think I'm going to be using it. I might bring it back out, but I'm not sure. So I'm just going to, on this bar between the icons and the tree view, I'm going to just hover over this top little left arrow icon so that it creates a minimize left pane pop-up. I'm just going to click that. So now our view is much bigger here, and we can kind of go over what some of all of this stuff is. So across the top, we can see that we have here sort of a similar navigation to this folder structure like we do that locates the path of the objects that we're working on. That is also visible up here. So you can actually navigate in and out of various locations in your network using this. There's also a back key, which can take you back. This will take you back to sort of the previous location that you were in, and a forward key to bring us back to where we were. Now, moving along across the top here, we can use this pin key to sort of pin our viewport, so that even though I would hop out and jump into my grid, for example, you can see that, well, our grid is actually not being displayed. We have pinned down our torus network, which actually has a pig head displayed right now, but we are actually pinned to that other network. If I untick this pin, we have now popped back into the grid network. I'm going to hit the U key to dive up, and here we are back into our object level. Other things, we briefly touched on this before, but we've got our different viewing modes. This is like, you have your pure wireframe mode. You've got your flat shaded mode, which basically doesn't take into account any normals and facets all of your geometry. And you got your smooth shaded, which actually, tries to smooth your geometry. And smooth wire shaded is sort of a combination of the both. And hidden line invisible looks like it actually is just a wireframe of the forward facing polygons. And wireframe ghost, it's just different viewing modes that it kind of, you can see it sort of grays out the pig head's back faces a little bit. And flat wire shaded is, again, faceted, but it actually has a wireframe showing up. I tend to mostly use smooth shaded or smooth wire shaded, but those options are there and are available to you. Additionally, we had already gone over the show all and ghost other objects, but just as a refresher, the show all objects, if I show all the sphere and grid object, if I say hide other objects, that's not going to do anything until we dive into our torus and pighead network. So you can see in here, everything else is hidden. I say ghost other objects, we get a X-ray of everything else. And I say show all, and we have everything visible in our network down here. Going back up to the top, I'm going to hide the sphere and the grid for now, and let's talk about this next one. So this next section here, we can use our single view or our quad view or do split screen. So if I wanted to do 4 views, it's just drag select that. You can see we've got our top view, front view, and right view, and our main view right here. Another thing that you can do that I often do is let's going back to the single view. If you hit spacebar 2, that actually will shortcut you to your top view. Spacebar 3 will go to your front. Hitting spacebar 3 again, you can see the note right here that we're in our front view. If we hit spacebar 3 again, it actually switches us and swaps us to our back view. And then I hit spacebar 1 to go back. So spacebar 1 is your perspective view. Spacebar 2, top or bottom, depending on how many times you hit it. Spacebar 3, front or back, depending on how many times you hit it. Spacebar 4 is right or left, depending on how many times you hit it. Then spacebar 5 will hop you into your UV view, which we're probably not going to get into for a while. But that's a shortcut to see the UVs in your scene. Going back to spacebar 1 to our perspective view. Another thing we can do to shortcut through these different split screens is we can hit the control key and let's say control 2. This actually gives us a split view. You can see our perspective and top have been selected here, but I could, if I wanted this to actually be the perspective in front, I could hit spacebar 3 while hovering over this window, or spacebar 1 even, and get an alternate perspective. Then again, moving on down this list of different views, you're basically doing the same thing. You're hitting, you can see here I hit control 2. There's control 3, which will bring up a 3 view, or control 4, which brings up the 4 view. Just going to go back to our main by hitting control 1 and then hitting spacebar 1 in case you are on some other view like this. Hit spacebar 1 and you're back into your perspective view. So moving along, you can see right here we've got this little drop down. This is another way you can set your view, and it gives you your keyboard shortcuts that we just sort of went over for your perspective, top, front viewports, etc. You can also here, if you go to your perspective viewport, you can also here determine if you actually want perspective on or if you want to do an orthographic view. So unticking that gives us an orthographic view. And let's just go back to our, let's just turn perspective back on. And here you can also select, what type of camera you want to use. We don't have any cameras in our scene, so let's just create one so we can see how that works real quick. One thing that's super handy is if I create a camera by clicking this camera icon up here in the lights and cameras shelf, it appears that I can just drop a camera down wherever I want, and here our camera is with our manipulator available. I can drag this around and sort of align my camera however I want this way. Another way I can do it is, you can see it's created a camera over here in our network. I'm going to just align our geometry and our rendering objects to be 2 separate little stacks here. I'm going to delete that camera. The way I normally like to make a camera is I kind of position my camera into the position that I want it, and then I'll come up here and control click the camera icon on the shelf, and that'll actually make a camera out of your current view. Now, if I'm going to want to reposition this camera, you'll notice if I start to tumble around by hitting Alt and left mouse click dragging, I'm moving, but it's actually left my camera where it was originally. My camera has not changed at all. Now I'm tumbling around. My camera is been left in the position that it was in. And the way we control that is using this little lock icon. Now, if I go up to this section here, you can see it says no camera is selected. I'm going to, from this drop down, select camera 1, and now we're back into this view. Now, if I go over here and hit the lock key, or the lock button, you can see that a little lock has appeared next to our camera here, and now I am actually moving around that camera. If I hit spacebar 2, if I hit spacebar 1, then control 2, and get an alternate view over here, you can see I have my camera, which is over here. I'm going to select the camera. I'm going to lock it, and then as I tumble around over here, you can see that camera updating on the left-hand side. Cool. Control 1 to go back to our normal view, and so that's how the camera locking works. It's just something to be aware of. It also gives you a nice little control here in your scene. If you wanted to zoom in and out, it gives you this nice little arrow here where you can drag to zoom in and out. You can change the roll, or even pan left, or tilt left and right, or up and down, and also just pan up or down. Very explicit axis independent object oriented controls, or object aligned controls, I should say. Similarly to how we're able to create cameras, another really handy feature is creating lights. So I'm going to unclick this so that we pop out of our camera view. Our camera's there. We can also, let's hit the selection icon. I'm going to select our light. We can also look through our lights. So if I pull this menu up here down, I can say look through light, area light, and you can see here I am, and now, now I popped out. I didn't hit the lock key. I'm going to do that one more time. Look through light, area light 1. Here I'm in the light. If I hit the lock key, now I'm actually relighting by moving my object, moving my view around. So if I unclick the lock and zoom out, you can see that I've repositioned my light. Also, what I could do is, if I wanted to create another light, similarly to how I control clicked to create the camera, I could create like a rim light, for example. Let's come back here and just angle ourselves up and control click this area light. And you can see it's turned our view into a light and created a light down here for us. So going to put this over here, and we're not locked right now, but if I lock, I'm now, moving around the light. I've got the same similar controls to the camera, and if I unlock, move back, you can see that it has created our light and space there for us as well. My view is a little Dutch right now. I'm going to just hit spacebar H to home, and now my horizon is all aligned. So other things on the bar over here is our grid button. We can turn that on and off. That just shows and hides our grid. It shows and hides our construction plane. We've done the lock. So these other icons down here actually show different lighting modes. This is no lighting whatsoever. You can see there's literally no shading on the object. Here, if I click this one, this is just the headlight only. So this is sort of more of a traditional view. You can see it's actually just being lit. It's lighting the scene as if there were no lights other than a headlamp attached to the camera. If I click this light down here, this is normal lighting. This actually is just, just a slightly higher quality lighting, and then the quality levels go up from there, which they aren't really making that much of a difference in our scene, but you can see that it's trying to do things like shadowing, etc. For whatever reason, I've had, I'm going to turn my grid off here. Sometimes I've had bad luck with doing shadows in the viewport, but it looks like they're working. It looks like they're working well enough right now. Let's just see if I can't grab this and yeah, it seems like it's making shadows and doing some ambient occlusion stuff there. Those settings, you can find those sort of in here. If you just hold down on these icons and drag off to the right, you can get a little pop-up menu of what all that stuff is. So moving on, down here, other handy things that I use are visualizers. So if I click this, this will actually display all the points in my scene, give them little blue dots. It's going to change my lighting back to headlight mode, just a little bit easier to see. But yeah, you can see where all the points in our scene are. This is handy, like, you know, for whatever reason, if you were just on smooth shaded mode, but you wanted to see where sort of points were, there's that option. There's this normals option, which will actually show your vertex normals for all of your objects in your scene. And also this one here is a velocity trail. We don't actually have any velocity set up on our objects, but if they were moving and we had computed a velocity attribute, we would get a nice little trail vector pointing in the direction of the object, pointing away from the direction that the object was moving. So cool. Other things, point number visualization. This will come in handy later. Primitive normals, different than point normals. So these are at the center of each face. So yeah, we've got our vertex normals and our primitive normals. Those can be visualized that way. And also primitive numbers. This will come in handy as well later on. Other things, we can visualize our vertexes and our groups and attribute lists. All this stuff we'll get into a little bit more later, but those are some of the main ones that I wanted to go over briefly just now. These other buttons over on the left, you can see that they will actually change the context of what we're doing. So if I have, for example, my torus selected, you see I can't really select the faces of the torus. If I go into the select key, I'm just selecting the entire torus network, which is, I'm really going to name this torus and pig heads network, just so that it's not just so it's obvious what we're actually dealing with. Suppose I wanted to grab a face. I can't really do that. If I click on this icon, this is for selecting primitives. Now I'm in here and I could and I'm in the grid object. Let's get back up here. Here, if I select faces, you can see it has actually dropped me down into our network and selected the displayed node. And now I can do my selection here. So we're going to get into more about what all these icons on the left-hand side do later on, but just know that they're there for now, and we'll sort of explore how we're able to control our geometry in a later lesson. So back up at the object level, another important thing that we kind of briefly touched on before was the D key. So if I hit the D key, before we use it to turn our environment light on and off as a background, I don't think that that's appearing because of the view mode that we're in, but yeah, if I switch this over to normal lighting and then untick this, you can see our HDRI appears in the background. I'm just going to turn it off again, but we've got our other viewing modes. Turning the grid off here, you can see that our normal light scheme has this kind of blue gradient in the background. I'm just going to switch that to dark. This comes in handy when you've got, like, you know, maybe darker particles in your scene and you're having a hard time seeing them. This lets you have a black background, or you can also do a gray background. I'm just going to leave it on light for now, but there's tons of display options to explore in here. Another one I find super handy is if I go over to the guides section, you notice if I turn off my actual torus and pighead node here, I've got this origin gnomon. Sometimes it can be a little bit annoying, and it's on by default, I think. So I'm just going to untick that, and you can see that by clicking that, it makes it go away. Might be a little bit hard to see. I'm going to switch the background to dark just to illustrate this big red thing in the middle here. If I untick under guides, origin gnomon, that'll disappear. Floating gnomons, this little guy in the corner, see, turn that on and off. It appears and disappears. Cool. So those are sort of things that I generally tend to try and handle. You can deal with all sorts of things like level of detail, point size, your guides, the size of your normal view, your point marker size, etc. We'll get into probably some of this later, but that's just important to know that if something's going on in your viewport, hit the D key and it brings up this little window, and you can pretty much you can get a bunch of stuff done in here. So it's good to know that it's there. Other cool things to note about this view over here, I'm just going to turn the grid back on. I'm going to hit the D key. I'm going to turn off my origin gnomon. And I'm going to hide my my torus and pig heads. So really I kind of just have a blank scene. similarly to how we use the tab key over here to create stuff on our network, we can do it over here. So I could also, for example, throw down some more test geometry by hitting tab and typing down squab and hitting enter. And if I hit enter one more time, it'll create the squab test geometry at the world origin. Just going to click away at that, and it's kind of some cool, I guess it's a combination between a squid and a crab, hence the name squab. I think I heard somebody say that at some point, but I have no idea. You can use the tab key in the view section to create and manipulate your geometry over here, but it has subtle differences in how it actually is creating your networks on the right. You can see it's thrown down the squab object off to the right here. So if we were inside of this squab object, you could also throw down, for example, your mountain here, type mountain and hit enter. And it didn't do anything. Like I think like maybe if I select these faces and type mountain, then yeah, there it has created a mountain, and it's only manipulating those faces over here. So this is just a subtle difference to note. When you're creating objects on the left, it's sort of expecting you to be providing a screen space input, and then it'll wire it in accordingly over here. And then this group is to denote literally every single face that I just selected. So I'm just going to hit Control A and delete. So it's just something to make note is if you're getting weird behavior and you're using the tab key to create operators over here, it's doing its best to figure out what you're trying to do and then wiring it in over here. So that's just a subtle difference to note. We'll be kind of encountering this some more, but I generally, for the most part, make most of my nodes in the network view, but there are some times when it's kind of handy to create them using the interaction of the viewport itself. So a slightly alternative way of doing that is by using the C key, which is to bring up your which brings up your radial menu. So I'm going to hit C here. You can see I've got my radial menu appearing. So if I wanted to, for example, grab like this face right here and do something to it, I can grab this. I can go up here to primitive selection mode and hit my select key, which is S, to bring this arrow up. And now I'm selecting like a primitive here. And suppose I wanted to extrude this using the radial menu. I could hit the C key, go up to Model, Polygons, Poly Extrude, and click. And there it's created a little manipulator for me. Manipulator has been selected over here, and it's created a Poly Extrude node over here. And I'm just going to pull this out, and I have now extruded that face. If I undo real quick, an alternative way of doing that, hit the select button, select it. I could hit tab, type poly extrude, enter, and it's just done the same thing. It's created that there, and it's got my manipulator selected and highlighted, and now I can extrude that face out right there, like so. Also of noting, it's written out, that we've selected polygon number 355 here to do that too. So if I go back up to this node, you can see this is our geometry we had before I provided that poly extrude. And if I turn on the primitive number, you'll see it's kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can bring up the size of the of this text so it's a little bit more legible. Oh, here, so under guides, I'm just going to change the size of this primitive display. I'm going to make the guide font to be large. You can see it's a little bit more obvious here. Let's just close that. So when I selected this icon, so when I selected this polygon, it created that extrude. It's literally just plopping in that number 355. Now the primitive count has changed because we've just added it here in this step, but you can see that by adding this poly extrude after selecting that, it is automatically determined that we are trying to poly extrude group number 355, which is the primitive number 355. seems a little bit over the top in terms of how precise it is, but all this stuff comes in handy later. You just got to trust me. So I'm going to turn off the primitive numbers. I'm going to get rid of this poly extrude, this mountain. I'm just going to go back to this for now. And let's see here. Let's just talk briefly about how to manipulate the layout. So similar to like in Cinema 4D, what you can do is you can kind of if it's got this little pad, you can just kind of click and drag your panes around. That doesn't quite work the same way in Houdini. Briefly before, when we were talking about adding sections or bringing out this tree view over here, you can hover over this bar and it pops it out like that. You can see between each one of these panes there is a little section like that. So if I throw this one back in that direction, you can see, let's mess with this one between our parameter view and our network view. So this one, we've got this bar. We can drag it up and down to sort of determine how much space we want each one to take up. We could collapse this parameter view away by hitting this key right here, which sends it up. So it's now hiding up here behind this little bar, and I hit this icon back down, it expands it down. And likewise on the right hand side of this bar, I can expand the parameter view all the way down. Our network view is hidden down here. So let's bring this back up. I'm going to grab the middle part and drag it up. And if I actually wanted to swap these, I could do that as well. So I could, by hitting this middle button right here. So I'm going to do that. And you can see our network is now on the top and our parameter view is now on the bottom, and has actually brought all those tabs along with it. So you can see our takes, list, and performance monitor also swaps down here to the bottom when I do that. If I alt click on this, it actually will pivot it to be left and right instead of up and down. So that's another way you can manage moving your layout. Suppose you wanted to, split this view in top and bottom. You could actually go up here to your upper right hand corner and see here it says split pane left right or split pane top bottom. So you can actually add a second view down here, and it'll just add a scene view, for example, because we were using a scene view up here. If I wanted to add my render view down here, so I could have my scene view and my render view up at the same time, for example, I could hit this plus icon and see a new pane tab type. I could go and select from this list my render view, and now it's created a new render view for us. If I go back up top and hit render, it is going to do the whole rendering thing. Now render view is also available up here, which is funny because we actually have two render views. One of them is working, the other one isn't, but that's just was a part of this layout. So you can continue to work that layout however you want to, splitting these in half, collapsing them down, etc. So I'm going to just cancel that render right now. I'm going to close both of those, and it is closed out that tab entirely, and it is now just back to our normal scene view. So that works for any of these. You can add a tab up here if you wanted to. You could add, you could do anything you want in that regard. If I put my network view back to where it was, sometimes what you'll see me do is I'll actually bring my network, I want more view of my network. I'll actually collapse my parameters view up. And then when I'm in my network view, if I hit the P key, it'll bring up my parameters in the corner over here, and I can just kind of have them off to the side while I'm working on something, larger inside of here. I have more going on. It just sort of moves things off to the side. I find that to be kind of nice sometimes. Also, another thing that is that can be kind of handy is you might need to go full screen. One way you can do that is up here. If you click this icon, this is maximize pane icon. This brings your whole network full view, and you can get really you can just get a better view of it if that's what you're after. I think that the key command for that, which I use, is Control B. Yeah, that works. So if we hit Control B over while our mouse is hovering over the scene view, we can get a full screen scene view. Super handy sometimes. Control B, and we're back. If you find yourself running into a situation where you have a layout that you like and you want to save it, you can go up here to your where it says build, or it might say something else in your case. But in my case, I was on the build layout. I can save this as a new desktop, and I could say this is save current desktop as, and say, I'll call this MF split view. You'll see me label a lot of things MF. I get jokes about that all the time, but MF just sort of helps me denote the fact that I made it up, and you don't have to do it, but I'll just put that there instead of like my split view, whatever. It's just a habit from old days. But if I click save here, it has created my new split view for me and saved it as an actual layout that I can select from my list up here. So that's cool. I don't really want to keep that, so I just am going to hop down to my desktops manager. I'm going to grab my my MF split view, and I'm just going to delete it because I don't really need it. But you can create any type of layout you like and save it there. I hope that you guys thought that that was awesome, and I know that that's kind of dry, but we're really just trying to get you comfortable with how to use the interface, how to get around with stuff, and feel comfortable, so you don't feel so lost. Because I know that that's a lot of it for a lot of people. A lot of the challenge is, this is such an alien interface for me. Why is it so difficult, for me to get around, etc. So I hope that you found that interesting and exciting. I promise it's going to get more exciting from here on forward. But yeah, now that we've accomplished that, we're going to get into the basics chapter of start doing stuff like selecting and manipulating geometry a little bit more, and just some of the other things that come along with knowing a 3D package. So stay tuned.